From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We start, as we do every day, with a check on the markets. Abigail Doolittle is here, and I looked at him a little bit down in the equity markets, but I don't see a whole lot of movement there, Abigail.
I would agree with you on David. It does feel a little bit ho-hum. You know, earlier today on the open, there was a bit of a bearish tone. The S&P 500 at that point was down more than 1%. Now down about 0.3%. It feels as though stocks are in a bit of a holding pattern. Investors waiting for more information. Where we have a little more action, however, is the FANG index. It's actually slightly higher, and that comes on Tesla, because Tesla, of course, the news came out yesterday after the bell that stock is finally being added to the S&P 500. So at the highs, Tesla up about 13%, its best day since July. Right now in the NASDAQ 100 and that FANG index, so that's the boost that we have there. And interesting around Tesla is it's such a big company, they're considering breaking it up into two different addings in December, which has never happened before. And then, of course, throwing a little excitement into the game, David, as we always talk about bonds. Bonds are higher today. That supports the bigger decline that we had for the S&P 500 earlier. At this point, the gain that we're seeing for bonds, the decline in yield, probably is a little bit more outsized than the pullback that we have for stocks. So perhaps there's some volatility to come, but not today, it doesn't seem.
One place there was movement, I think at least, is in prescription drug sales, because Amazon decided they're going to come into that business, and it's affected some of the other prescription drug sellers.
Absolutely. Big moves here. So Amazon itself, not surprisingly, is higher on the news that they are opening this online pharmacy where they'll be able to sell drugs on a digital basis, discounts to Prime members. On this, you have the likes of CVS, Walgreens, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, basically anything involved in the drugstore supply chain or drugstore down in a big way as the e-commerce giant is getting into the business. Now, this has been thought that it would happen for a while, but now that's all of a sudden, here, again, you see the big selling pressure in the healthcare drug chain. Amazon itself off the highs, but nonetheless, in a ho-hum day, it's up 0.7%.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter are spending their day testifying once again before Congress. This time, not about antitrust issues, but about how they've handled political speech. We welcome now Matt Perault. He is director of the Center on Science and Technology Policy at Duke University. He earlier served as director of public policy at Facebook. So, Matt, thank you so much for being with us. I think this is all, as I understand, about Section 230 of the Communications Act. Let's go back to exactly what that provides. It was enacted, as I understand, in 1996, which is the Stone Age, basically, when it comes to social media. And in essence, as I understand it, it says if you're providing what they call an interactive computer service, you're not a publisher, and that means you can't sue me. What is the real thrust of this today? Because it's a different world today.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, and thanks so much for having me on. So the core of Section 230 is that it provides immunity for platforms for content posted by people who use those platforms. So if you're hosting content as opposed to content creator, you're not liable for the content of the communications.
So the interesting thing was Senator Lindsey Graham, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, started right out with the question, if you're making decisions to take certain speech down, and we're talking about tweets as well as Facebook posts related to the elections, if you're deciding to take them down, aren't you an editor, and shouldn't you be liable?
So actually, the purpose of Section 230 was to enable content moderation. So Section 230 was designed to protect platforms and enable them to actually take steps to moderate content, problematic content on their platforms, and to not have to be conflicted about whether they might be liable if they took steps to actually address problematic content.
But then what is the effective check on these companies making arbitrary decisions or blatantly wrong decisions? I mean, we do have, as you know, laws, libel laws, basically, that says that the publisher of the New York Times can't be reckless, even with a public subject, in deciding what to say and what not to say.
So that's right, but there's broad First Amendment protections in the United States. Those broad First Amendment protections protect publishers, and they also protect companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google when they're making content moderation decisions. So the government cannot tell private companies how to moderate speech on their platforms. The platforms are subject to a whole bunch of other areas of law, and those were raised in the hearing as well. So they're subject to national security law, they're subject to antitrust law, and so there are other mechanisms that can hold private companies liable.
But why do they need further protection beyond what the libel laws already provide? As you say, there's a pretty high standard, at least when it's a public figure or a public subject, of recklessness. Why do they have just essentially absolute immunity?
So it's a great question. I don't think of Section 230 as protecting the companies as much as it protects a model for a certain kind of technology that enables people like me to speak freely on tech platforms and to reach a broader audience. Decades ago, we had more gatekeepers who stood in the way of people having the ability to speak freely and share information with each other. Section 230 makes those types of business models possible, and it doesn't just protect large platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter, it protects smaller startup companies as well. If legislators were to decide that we wanted to roll back Section 230 protections, those types of business models would go away, and instead of having user-generated platforms, user-generated content platforms like Facebook and Twitter, the internet would feel more like your experience on Netflix or Spotify, where you actually have to get a licensing deal with a provider in order to have your content shared.
So, Matt, you say that it's to protect your ability to communicate on social media, but it doesn't protect everybody's right to do it, because one of the issues that the Republicans, I must say, on the Judiciary Committee today are really focused on are some more conservative or Republican posts that have been taken down or at least have had flags put on them, say, maybe you shouldn't quite believe this.
Right. So that's right. So platforms can moderate speech on their sites. But if Section 230 was rolled back further and platforms were liable for everything that every user posts on their site, and on sites like Facebook and Twitter, that's millions or billions of posts on a daily basis. It's a very difficult content moderation task. It's likely that the spaces for expression would actually be narrower because platforms wouldn't permit controversial speech if they thought it was going to land them in court.
What about some alternatives that aren't necessarily rolling back, to use your term, Section 230, but doing other things? Because as I understand it, we had Mr. Dorsey say, actually, it's all about the algorithms, and people should be able to choose which algorithm they use, if I understood correctly what he was saying. On the other hand, Mr. Zuckerberg was saying it's all about transparency, and he's actually, I think, in favor of some government regulation of transparency.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see a trend in the direction of social media companies actually supporting government regulation in this area. And I think that's because they have felt like they've been under intense scrutiny, intense criticism for a long period of time when they've tried to moderate content. And they'd like rules of the road to help them understand exactly what government wants out of them. And so you saw both companies calling today for more regulation, a better appeals process, more transparency, and they'd like to see regulation that would make that possible. For instance, in order for companies to be able to share more information with researchers and others who want to study this problem, companies would need to have protections once they share that information. Facebook, when it shared data with a researcher at Cambridge, ended up in a massive scandal that resulted in a significant fine and changes to the company's business practices. And so in order to facilitate sharing of data with researchers, lawmakers need to make that possible, and it's nice to see that there might be more momentum in that direction.
Matt, it's far from clear that there will ever be legislation, but assuming that there were legislation to somehow curtail some of this immunity, what would be the business effect of it? Because it strikes me that I'm not sure that Facebook or even Twitter, certainly Google, they don't need a lot of protection right now. They're pretty big boys. They can take care of themselves. What would it do to upstarts who are trying to get into the social media business?
I think that's a really important point. So as you say, a company like Facebook, I think Facebook currently has more than 30,000 people who are responsible for safety and security on its platform. That's an enormous number of people who are looking closely at the content on the site and trying to make the site as safe and secure as they possibly can. A startup company is not going to be able to devote those kinds of resources to moderating content. And so the underlying purpose of Section 230 was to enable these types of business models where you have a platform that provides a vehicle for speech, and individuals who use that platform are responsible for the content of the speech. That's important for smaller companies who just can't devote the kinds of resources to protecting safety and security that larger platforms might be able to.
As you know terribly well, these are truly global companies. What's going on with regulation along these lines elsewhere? I mean, I've heard a lot, for example, in the European Union about antitrust or competition law regulation. I haven't heard as much about political speech. Are other jurisdictions around the world taking a look at the same issues?
They are. There's activity in the UK, there's activity in the European Union, and there's been significant activity in Australia as well. And that, as you say, it's on antitrust issues, but for some of these jurisdictions, they're thinking about new mechanisms to hold platforms more broadly accountable. So there have been proposals, for instance, for digital platforms authorities or institutions within government that would actually closely monitor activity on social networks and make sure that that activity was consistent with government, with best practices laid out by government. And so I think it's likely that we'll see more and more of that kind of government action, even if Section 230 isn't rolled back.
Okay, Matt, really great to have you here today. You're the man we wanted to talk to. That's Matt Perault. He's director of Duke University's Center on Science and Technology Policy. You could see, if you were watching on television as opposed to radio, you could see the hearing that are ongoing. If you want to follow those, you can go to the Bloomberg terminal and put in Live Go, and you can follow them live. Coming up, COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations are surging all around the country. We talk with the man whose company is on the front lines, Dr. Ed Rocht of Global Medical Response. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you very much. Senator Lindsey Graham is denying that he urged a Republican elections official to throw away mail-in ballots. Georgia's Secretary of State told the Washington Post that Senator Graham asked him whether he had the power to toss all mail-in ballots from certain counties, arguing that elections clerks may have accepted ones with non-matching signatures for political reasons. Senator Graham calls the claims, quote, ridiculous. America's effort to revive its virus-battered economy has been put on pause or thrown into reverse. Across much of the United States, new infections are soaring at the fastest pace since the earliest days of the pandemic. California has reimposed bans on many indoor businesses. Michigan has ordered a partial 3-week shutdown. And Oregon, Washington, and New Jersey have tightened restrictions. New York City's COVID-19 positive test rate over a 7-day average is 2.74%, below a 3% threshold that would trigger a shutdown of in-person schooling. Mayor Bill de Blasio said today, quote, New York City continues to hold on. The city's public school system, the largest in the United States, is operating on a day-to-day basis. Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley says he will immediately quarantine after being exposed to someone who tested positive for COVID-19. That tightens the margin for the GOP to confirm Judy Shelton to the Federal Reserve Board. With 3 Republican senators opposing Shelton and Florida Republican Rick Scott also in quarantine, Republicans could fall short of the votes they need to confirm her. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Last spring, when the first COVID crisis hit the United States, EMTs were called upon to give the first line of defense, including the 38,000 men and women who work at Global Medical Response, transporting some 5 million patients a year to hospitals and other medical facilities all around the country. Now we're heading into a new wave of the pandemic, and we welcome Dr. Ed Rocht. He is Chief Medical Officer of Global Medical Response. So welcome back to Bloomberg. Good to have you here, Doctor. Let's start first with what you're seeing on the front lines right now as we see the numbers both of infections and also of hospitalizations spike up. How is that affecting your business?
Yeah, as you can imagine, the volume is increasing. The difference this time from the previous components of the illness is that this is more, it's spread throughout a variety of different communities, including the rural and the frontier environment, those that are difficult to access. The number of patients is increasing. We're also now starting to see patients who had been infected with COVID, who have either prolonged illness or residuals from that illness that are seeking care in a healthcare environment. So remember, a lot of primary care has moved to telemedicine and away from the bricks and mortar care during this time period. So there are patients that are seeking that level of care through the front doors of the emergency medicine system.
Are you testing your capacity yet, or do you see yourself doing that? And I must say, we've talked to other public health officials who say this may be different from the last time because it's so all around the country, so we can't redeploy assets from one place to another.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it is a concern for the front line of healthcare throughout the hotspots. So the maps in the early phases of this illness had hotspots. We were able to deploy the men and women throughout the country to the hotspot. We were able to rotate them through. So there's an intensity to managing this population in the field. This is different. This is more of a nationwide impact. Communities are starting to see larger volumes, again, urban and the rural environment. And we don't have as much capacity as an EMS profession to take from lower impact areas and move those providers to a higher impact area. So this is a new stressor on the frontline EMS system, no doubt.
One of the issues last spring at least, was PPE, personal protective equipment. How are you set for that right now? Do you think we have enough that we've stockpiled?
So we, as an organization, our organization was very concerned about this early on. And as I think we've all learned over time, it's not just appropriate PPE, it's PPE that has been produced appropriately. So we've seen a challenge with masks and different types of PPE that may not meet the standards. And we made a decision that we would essentially move way ahead in anticipating that we're going to need this PPE for a period of time. It is a constant discussion, and it's a constant effort on the part of the front line to make sure we are way ahead, not knowing where the end of this particular surge is going to be. We know there's an end. We know that there will be a time, but we just don't know when that will be yet.
Yeah, it's clear by all accounts we're going to have a rough patch between here and then, whenever the then is. But let's talk for a minute about the then, because we've had now 2 reports, promising reports of vaccine candidates, and more apparently may well be on the way. At the same time, there will be issues about distributing the vaccine when it comes time. I think of your organization as basically transporting patients to medical facilities, but could you be involved in the transportation of vaccines to get millions upon millions of doses distributed?
Absolutely. And we're in the midst of discussions with a variety of entities about that exact concept. So you're spot on. The EMS system has historically brought emergency medical providers to the patient side and then brought the patient to definitive care. In this circumstance, there are literally hundreds of thousands of individuals in the rural and frontier environment that have great difficulty in accessing care. So one of the concepts is to move the vaccine to that community and to mass vaccinate those individuals using the flight nurses, paramedics, EMTs in that environment as appropriate to the state to administer that vaccine. The challenges to address in that are how to transport those effectively. So as you know, both of the vaccine candidates require refrigeration, one significant, -94, the other -4, but it does require a tremendous amount of vigilance and appropriate distribution methodologies to make that work. So this is clearly a partnership of healthcare providers and transporters to tackle those hard to hit areas that aren't going to have the same kind of access to the vaccine.
In the event that we do get one or more vaccines and we need mass distribution, what's the role of the government, whether state government or federal government? Are you in discussions with the current administration, for example, as part of Warp Speed as distribution, or for that matter, even the transition into a Biden administration?
So the government, both the federal and state governments, regulatory entities, departments of health, manage those programs. So this is an orchestra of individuals who set the criteria, who oversee, who empower, who allow the vaccine to be distributed as it should be distributed. And if I could rewind for a bit, there probably 8 to 10 years ago, there was a concern about how to get seasonal influenza vaccine to these same kinds of communities. That's where the EMS world stepped up and said, look, we have healthcare providers who are very capable of administering the vaccine, of looking at how that's done programmatically. How do we now translate those efforts and those historical successes into the COVID-19 vaccination time period? So a lot of players involved, a lot of priorities, and we're interacting with all of those at the state and at the federal level.
Well, we're all rooting for you. I think I can say that with confidence. Thank you so much, Doctor. Great to have you with us. That is Dr. Ed Rocht, Chief Medical Officer for Global Medical Response. And a programming note, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll be joined by HHS Secretary Alex Azar on the subject of vaccine and distribution. That'll be on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Check on a big market mover. Home improvement stores are seeing more customers and a higher average sale these days. But for Home Depot, that wasn't enough for the quarter. Joining us now is Kaylee Lyons.
Well, David, Home Depot is lower by about 3.4% today, but home improvement is hot right now. A lot of people have spent most of the year inside their homes and therefore investing in them. That has benefited not just home builders in terms of home sales, but stores like Home Depot. And you saw that show up in their comparable sales data that they released for the third quarter, jumping a whopping 24%. That followed up a growth of 23% in the second quarter. But where the bad news comes in is that even though revenue is rising, costs are rising too. Their costs up per sale, which of course is how much they have to invest to get each sale dollar, was up 24%. That's largely related to things that they've had to do, extra cleaning in the stores, protective equipment for their employees. All of those costs do start to add up, and Home Depot said today it is planning to invest an additional $1 billion in worker compensation going forward. So that is weighing on the shares today. It's actually the fifth quarter in a row that Home Depot has fallen after reporting results, even after beating in terms of estimates. And another issue that could be an issue for Home Depot going forward is their pro business, which caters to professional contractors and the like. As the pandemic worsens, if that starts to weigh on their businesses, that could weigh on Home Depot's business in return. And I should note that the pandemic, of course, a factor for retailers across the board. We also heard from Walmart earlier today. Again, they are benefiting from people stocking up in stores due to the pandemic. That did mean comp sales and especially e-commerce sales were up 79%, but they couldn't give a forecast given all the uncertainty around the virus, David.
And this all comes against the backdrop, as you know so well, of the retail sales numbers out today, which were disappointing both for last month and also revised down for the prior. But then I read from Stephen Stanley over at Amherst Pierpont that in fact they revised them up for August. So good news or bad news? I don't know.
It's a little bit of both. I mean, the October numbers clearly were disappointing. Retail sales rose just 0.3%. Economists were looking for 0.5%, and that was the slowest rate in about 6 months. So it shows that recovery we had seen even through the summer is starting to slow, and you could maybe say that is because of a couple things, maybe a sentiment issue, people not wanting to go out and shop because of the pandemic. But also, David, we have to consider we haven't gotten any more fiscal stimulus, and that means consumers have less cash in their wallets right now, David.
I was going to be disappointed if we got through that without talking about stimulus. Thanks so much to Kaylee Lyons. Up next, we look at the next 4 years of a Biden administration as it deals with the always difficult relations in the Middle East. Martin Indyk will be with us. This is Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. President-elect Joe Biden is starting to fill out his White House staff as he presses ahead with his transition. He's named his campaign's chief counsel, Dana Remus, as White House counsel. Senior campaign aides Jen O'Malley, Dylan, Steve Ricchetti, and Mike Donilon will join the Biden White House staff as well. Louisiana Congressman Cedric Richmond will give up his House seat for a role on the Biden team. India's prime minister is hoping to attract foreign investment to modernize India's urban centers as the nation rebuilds its economy after the coronavirus pandemic halted activity. Prime Minister Narendra Modi gave the keynote speech on the second day of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum.
We are looking at a future where a major chunk of education, healthcare, shopping, food experiences may happen online. Our city needs to be ready for the convergence of the physical and digital worlds.
Prime Minister Modi says India has completed work on 2/3 of its planned $30 billion worth of projects on building smart cities. The UK and European Union could reach a post-Brexit trading deal as soon as Monday. Bloomberg has learned the two sides are edging closer to agreement on the biggest sticking points. The urgency is ramping up with Britain's departure from the EU's single market on December 31st, fast approaching. Without an agreement, millions of consumers will face the return of quotas and tariffs for the first time in a generation. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. The Trump administration set a different course from what had come before in its Middle East policy. To help us look at what's likely to come next in the next 4 years with the Biden administration, welcome now Ambassador Martin Indyk, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served not once but twice as U.S. Ambassador to Israel. So welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Great to have you with us. And I guess where we should start was with the most recent news I've seen, reports that President Trump may well have considered and even proposed to his staff some sort of a military raid against Iran to take out their nuclear weapons, apparently, which was rejected. What do you make of that?
Well, there were two surprises in the story. The first, that President Trump would consider a strike against Iran, military strike, given that his basic instinct is to end wars in the Middle East, not start new ones. So surprising that he would think about starting one on his way out the door. The second surprise was that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who normally does not stand up to Trump, but basically goes along with whatever he wants, and is a known hardliner when it comes to Iran, apparently got the president to back away from this very bad idea.
So stepping back from that particular report, take a look at what happened with U.S.-Iran and U.S.-Israeli relations over the last 4 years, because they've taken a turn perhaps that we wouldn't have expected. To what extent was the Trump administration successful in actually, if not isolating, at least undermining Iran's position in the region by helping Israel apparently develop normalized relations with Bahrain, with UAE, with Sudan?
Yeah, so it's a tale of contrast. In the case of his policy towards Iran, he withdrew from the nuclear deal, and Iran then withdrew also and has been marching towards a bomb to the point where it's now back where it was before the agreement was signed, and they dismantled their nuclear capabilities and shipped out their stockpile of weapons grade material. So on the one hand, Trump has actually exacerbated the situation when it comes to nuclear weapons, despite the fact that he put huge pressure on Iran through sanctions, piled upon sanctions. On the Israeli side, of course, he improved the relationship with Israel quite dramatically. They worked together, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Trump have worked together on the Iran file. And as you point out, now there's been this breakthrough, which I think Trump does deserve some credit, of relations between the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Israel, which is of strategic consequence because they share, particularly the UAE and Israel, share a common adversary in Iran. And of course, the UAE is right across the Gulf from Iran, and that gives Israel better capability to operate against Iran should it need to. And overall, a better platform of Israeli and Sunni Arabs cooperating strategically, which the incoming Biden administration can use to help stabilize the region.
President-elect Biden has said that he would be open to resuming the JCPOA agreement with Iran if Iran goes back and makes some revisions in the agreement. What are the prospects of that, and how nervous does that make Israel? Because Israel did not like very much that JCPOA when it was introduced by the Obama administration.
Well, I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu will like it at all. He urged Trump to break the agreement, and he's been very much egging on Pompeo and before him Bolton on this maximum pressure campaign against Iran. But President-elect Biden has a very different approach. He wants to bring Iran back into the agreement, get rid of that stockpile that they've been building up now of potentially weapons-grade uranium, shut down the centrifuges again, and then negotiate to deal with the problems that the original JCPOA agreement did not agree with, such as the sunset clauses in the agreement and ballistic missiles and Iran's sponsorship of terrorism across the region. To get Iran back into the agreement, I think can be done in part by the United States lifting the multilateral sanctions that it reimposed when Trump left the deal. But as for negotiating or renegotiating the deal, that's going to be more difficult. The one thing that Biden has in his favor in this regard, ironically, is that all those unilateral sanctions which Trump put on Iran can now be used as leverage. Lifted in that.
Sorry, I was just breaking up there a little bit. So, Ambassador, and coming back to U.S.-Israeli relations, one of the things that cemented those under President Trump was basically President Trump just bypassing the Palestinians altogether, something you know terribly well about, because in addition to other responsibilities, you were our emissary at one point for the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. Is that a viable strategy? It appears that they got some Arab countries to go along with that, to just say, let's just put the Palestinians off to the side.
Well, Trump actually didn't intend to put the Palestinians off to the side. He wanted to make a peace deal. His deal of the century was a deal between Israel and the Palestinians, not between Israel and the Gulf Arab states of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. He was, in effect, the accidental peacemaker. While he pushing for the Palestinians, he was ready to, a Palestinian deal, he was ready to green light Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank. That drove the Emiratis to say, stop the annexation and we'll normalize. And Trump was smart enough to get behind that. So we had that breakthrough. It wasn't a breakthrough to peace. These countries were not at war with Israel, and it didn't help solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. But it at least moves the Arabs towards more normal relations with Israel. And that's a good thing for Israel and a good thing for the United States.
What about the Saudis? A big question. Everybody's been saying, boy, if you could get the Saudis to normalize relations, that would be a huge deal. Is there any realistic prospect of that? Because as we know, the Saudis, I think, felt that President Trump was very much their friend.
Yes, I do think it's possible. It's certainly worth exploring, and I would expect President Biden to do so. The Saudi normalization with Israel would be the crown jewel of the whole normalization process because of its immense importance in the Arab and Muslim world. But I think the Saudis are a little more reluctant than the Emiratis. They have more at stake on the Palestinian issue. But more importantly, I think Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is in very bad odor in Washington, particularly with Democrats, but not only, also with Republicans, particularly for his involvement in the murder of that Saudi journalist, Adnan Khashoggi, but also for his conduct of the war in Yemen, which has created a huge humanitarian crisis. And so I think that President-elect Biden has a more jaundiced view of the Saudi Crown Prince than President Trump did. And if you like, it's a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card that Mohammed bin Salman could use by normalizing with Israel. He could suddenly improve his standing in Washington in a way that I don't think anything else could.
It's always such a pleasure to hear from you on these subjects. Thank you so much. That is Ambassador Martin Indyk, of Council on Foreign Relations Distinguished Fellow. Coming up here, 2 runoff Senate elections in Georgia will decide which party controls the Senate. Veteran pollster and political strategist Frank Luntz is here for a report. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The 2020 election is not over in the state of Georgia. Both Senate seats will be decided in a pair of runoff elections between Republican incumbents and Democratic challengers in early January. To get a read on the 2 races and the chances of Democrats taking both and therefore taking effective control of the Senate, welcome now veteran political strategist and pollster Frank Luntz. He's the founder of Luntz Global. So, Frank, it's a delight always to have you with us. Before we go forward to the runoff, let's go backwards to this election we just had in Georgia. What did we learn from how people voted on November 3rd that might inform what happens in January?
Well, there's a greater degree of working class voters that are swinging towards the Republicans than ever before. That Trump and the GOP did better among them than even Ronald Reagan when he hit the high water mark in 1984. Conversely, there is a greater degree of upper middle class voters, particularly women, particularly from suburbs, particularly moms with children, who are voting Democratic, and that is a high for the Democrats really since the 1960s. So you see this socioeconomic shift. Republicans shockingly doing well among working class, and Democrats shockingly doing well among upper middle class.
What was the turnout like? Because one of the things I hear is who wins these elections will depend on getting the vote out. But it must have been a massive vote in Georgia as it was elsewhere around the country.
The turnout in Georgia, everyone, I'm told that dead people voted in Georgia.
Watch it. We might get a tweet on that.
In fact, there's a break between, if you've only been dead for about 10 years, you tended to vote Democrat. If you've been dead for 10 to 30 years, you tended to vote Republican. And if you've been dead from, I don't know where the joke goes.
Yeah.
But it's a legitimate point that every human being voted. But here's the challenge for the GOP. And I'm going to surprise you. I think the Democrats have a fair shot at winning at least one of the seats because they can't wait for January 20th. They're watching the news more. They're participating more. They've been energized by all that's been going on. On the Republican side, because Trump keeps communicating that the system is rigged, the system is broken, there was corruption, I'm wondering whether there won't be a measurable segment of the GOP audience that stays home on January 5th because of what Trump's been saying, because he's been so demonizing the electoral process. And if they stay home, the Democrats win those seats.
At the same time, if you look at Mr. Ossoff, John Ossoff, he's got, I think, 90,000 votes he's got to make up. That's a pretty big number, isn't it?
It's a big number. He's also got $1 gazillion to make it up with. The Democrats have never been as well funded. The truth is, we've never had an election like Georgia before, and now we've got two of them. I believe that this is going to be as consequential for your viewers as anything in the presidential race, because if the Democrats win this, it means that Trump's tax cuts are repealed. It means that Puerto Rico and D.C. become a state. It means that they end the filibuster rules. So much changes if the Democrats win both of those seats.
You mentioned the money. There's an enormous amount of money. I've seen like $100 million supposedly is going to go into this for this campaign. Is there any point at which the people who live in Georgia, the natives, get resentful that so much money from out of state is coming in? Or do they love the attention?
Well, it's both. They love the attention and they want people to go away. They like the money being spent in their state, but they're tired of the political advertising. I wonder if people will still be watching it by the end of December. There's another 7 weeks down there of this kind of campaigning after having months, because Georgia became a swing state. And Georgia is not the same place today that it was even 4 years ago. Georgia is genuinely in play. Democrats have a real opportunity in the statewide races. They obviously now have proven that they can win in a national campaign. And even their legislature is likely to change over time. So you've got ground zero for all of politics in a state that you can drive in any direction and hit a border within 4 hours. So if you love politics, this is the place to be. And if you hate politics, I suggest you get out of the state right now.
Yeah, and if you run a local television station, it's a particular place you want to be right now. But I guess my question, you're suggesting this is that money going to be well spent? Because it's not like they haven't been seeing political ads all through the fall. Is a lot of that $100 million going to be wasted in your judgment?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And it's going to just agitate the population and divide them even more. Georgia is a tinderbox of emotion because of what happened in the wake of George Floyd and what's been happening down there, frankly, since the last gubernatorial election, which itself is very divisive. It is ground zero for national politics. It is ground zero for social justice and political reform. It is ground zero for just about every controversy that we have in this country. And probably what matters most is it's ground zero for voter participation. So you have people engaged, involved, agitated, divisive. All the good and certainly all the bad are happening in that state right now.
Well, it's quite a story, no question about it. Frank Luntz, pollster and founder of Luntz Global. We're going to have more with Frank coming up in our second hour at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up, former President Clinton and former Prime Minister Tony Blair with their thoughts on the U.S. relationship toward China going forward. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. China may be the top foreign policy issue for the incoming Biden administration. And former President Clinton joined former Prime Minister Blair at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum for their thoughts on how to move forward with the difficult U.S.-China relationship.
I think when you and I were in office, there was not an expectation exactly, but a hope that as China opened up and developed, then political development, not in terms of turning into a Western-style democracy, but political evolution in the direction of more liberalism. I think that was our hope, and possibly it certainly was my actual expectation. But you've got to say, in the last few years, there's been more external aggression and more internal repression. So that's just a fact. So that's what we're dealing with now. And I think the strategic relationship is very important to define, because you need America and Europe to work together. I think it would be bad if, as it were, Europe is kind of navigating between the US and China. And I think that strategic framework has to accept that there will be areas of confrontation, and you've just mentioned some now. There are inevitably areas of competition. Technology is going to be one. But you need to leave some space for cooperation. Because whether it's the pandemic or indeed what we'll talk about a bit later, climate change, none of these problems can be solved today without the participation of China. And, therefore we've got to, I think the analogies with the Cold War are kind of misplaced. And indeed, as some of the Bloomberg documents show for the forum, I mean, decoupling is going to be painful for both of us, for the West and for China. So I think this, if you can get as you rightly say, if the new president comes in and has a more strategic framework, then you can identify, consistent with that, areas of cooperation, and at least offer China the possibility, whatever differences there are, for those areas of cooperation to be fruitful for both sides.
I agree with that. I also think we can strengthen our negotiating position, if you will, or our cooperating position by reestablishing the relationships that we had with other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, who were our allies, who would have been the principal partners in the trade deal that President Trump killed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Whether the new administration chooses to revive that or not, we can clearly do more to strengthen our partnership and work with them. And we have to recognize and just level with people, the old Chinese system, which was by no means a democracy, still guaranteed enough debate and play and openness because there was a regular rotation of leadership. And now that it appears that a person is in charge of China who intends to stay there for life, in essence, that changes things. But we shouldn't accept or assume that it's all going to be bad without working to make it better. We got to try to, we got to give the new administration a chance to articulate an approach and then try to achieve, in cooperation with Europe and the United States and the international bodies, a strategic partnership which will enable us to do good things together and try to minimize the bad things that we think will happen if we just walk away.
Former President Bill Clinton and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. You can continue to watch the forum using the function Live Go on your terminal. It's also streaming on Bloomberg.com and NewEconomyForum.com. Coming up, Balance of Power continues with Alex Azar in our second hour on Bloomberg Radio.